The morning mist clung to the pine trees like ghostly fingers when Marcus first heard the sound, a low, guttural yowl that seemed to carry both desperation and hope. He paused in his work, hammer suspended mid-swing above the fence post he'd been mending. The sound came again, closer this time, and unmistakably feline. Marcus had lived alone in these Montana wilderness for 15 years, ever since retiring from his veterinary practice in Billings. He'd chosen this remote cabin precisely to escape the constant parade of sick and injured animals that had filled his days. The irony wasn't lost on him that the animals seemed to have followed him here anyway. Wounded deer occasionally wandered into his clearing, and he'd treated his fair share of injured ravens and foxes over the years. But this sound was different. This carried an urgency that made his practiced ear perk with recognition. He set down his tools and walked toward the tree line, following the intermittent calls. What he saw when he reached the edge of the clearing stopped him dead in his tracks. A female lynx sat 20 feet away, her tufted ears twitching nervously as she watched him. Her golden coat was matted with what looked like days of travel, and her amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. But what made Marcus's breath catch was what lay between her massive paws. A small, motionless cub. The mother lynx made no move to flee as Marcus approached. Instead, she looked directly at him and released another plaintive yowl, then gently nudged the cub with her nose. The tiny body was limp, its breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. Marcus had seen this behavior before, though never with a wild lynx. Desperate mothers, their maternal instincts overriding their natural fear, bringing their young to the one place they somehow knew might offer help. He'd witnessed it with domestic cats, with dogs, even once with a raccoon. But a lynx? They were notoriously elusive, avoiding human contact at all costs. "Easy, Mama," Marcus murmured, crouching down slowly. "Let me see." The lynx tensed, but didn't retreat. Her eyes never left Marcus's face as he inched closer. When he was within arm's reach, she did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. She carefully picked up her cub and placed it directly in front of him, then stepped back and sat, waiting. The cub was barely 3 weeks old, Marcus estimated, its spots still faint against gray-brown fur. A quick examination revealed the problem: severe dehydration and what felt like a fever. The little one's gums were pale, its tiny body burning with heat. Pneumonia, Marcus diagnosed quietly, speaking more to himself than to the watching mother. Maybe 2 days, 3 at most, if we don't act now. He looked up at the lynx, whose unwavering stare seemed to convey both trust and a terrible, desperate hope. In 30 years of veterinary practice, Marcus had never felt the weight of responsibility more acutely. "I need to take him inside," he said softly. "I can't help him out here." As if she understood, the lynx stood and followed as Marcus carefully lifted the cub and walked toward his cabin. She stopped at the porch steps but settled down in a sphinx-like position, clearly intending to wait. Inside, Marcus's old instincts kicked in. He set up a makeshift intensive care unit in his living room, heating pad for fluids, antibiotics he'd kept for emergencies. The cub was critical, its breathing labored, and its body temperature dangerously high. For the next 18 hours, Marcus didn't leave the cub's side. Every 2 hours, he administered fluids and medication. He monitored breathing, temperature, and heart rate with the same intensity he'd once brought to emergency surgeries. Through the window, he could see the mother lynx maintaining her vigil on the porch, occasionally standing to pace but never leaving. It was during the second night that the unbelievable began to unfold. Marcus had dozed off in his chair when a soft thud woke him. He opened his eyes to find the mother lynx inside his living room, having somehow managed to open the screen door. She approached the makeshift medical station where her cub lay, now breathing more steadily but still unconscious. Any reasonable person would have been terrified. A full-grown lynx in their living room was not a situation covered in any wilderness survival guide. But as Marcus watched, The mother carefully sniffed her cub, then settled down beside the heating pad and began to groom the tiny body with gentle, purposeful licks. What happened next defied everything Marcus thought he knew about wild animal behavior. The lynx looked directly at him and made a soft chirping sound, not a threatening vocalization, but something almost conversational. She then did something that made Marcus question his own eyes. She extended one massive paw toward him, not in aggression, but in what could only be described as a gesture of greeting. Hardly daring to breathe, Marcus slowly extended his own hand. The lynx sniffed it carefully, then, impossibly, touched her paw to his palm in the briefest of contacts before withdrawing. From that moment on, they became partners in the cub's care. The lynx, whom Marcus began thinking of as Luna, seemed to understand the treatment routine. When it was time for medication, she would gently hold the cub still. When Marcus needed to check vitals, she would step back but remained close enough to offer comfort. She brought gifts, freshly caught rabbits and fish, leaving them on the porch as if understanding that Marcus needed sustenance to continue his work. On the third day, the cub opened its eyes. Luna's reaction was profound. She made a sound Marcus had never heard before, part purr, part trill, part sob of relief. She nuzzled her baby gently, then looked at Marcus with an expression he could only interpret as gratitude. The cub, whom Marcus had started calling Scout, began to nurse eagerly. His fever broke, his breathing cleared, and within a week he was attempting to play with his own paws. But the truly unbelievable part was yet to come. As Scout grew stronger, Luna began bringing her other cubs, two siblings that Marcus hadn't known existed, to the cabin. They were healthy but clearly curious about this strange interspecies household. Soon, Marcus found himself hosting daily visits from an entire lynx family. The cubs learned to play in his yard while Luna hunted nearby. They discovered that the wooden deck made excellent climbing practice, and that Marcus's boots made wonderful toys. Scout, the smallest, remained closest to Marcus, often napping against his leg while he worked on the porch. Wildlife photographers and researchers who later heard the story called it impossible. Lynx simply didn't behave this way with humans. But Marcus had photos, video footage, and eventually, witnesses. Dr. Sarah Chun, a wildlife biologist from the University of Montana, was the first expert to visit. She arrived skeptical and left speechless, watching Luna's family interact with Marcus as if he were simply another member of their pride. "It's unprecedented," she told the documentary crew that came to film the story months later. "We're witnessing the formation of an entirely new type of interspecies relationship. The trust displayed here goes beyond anything recorded in scientific literature." As autumn approached and the cubs grew larger and more independent, Marcus knew the inevitable was coming. Wild animals belonged in the wild, no matter how profound the bond that had formed. Luna seemed to understand this too. The visits became less frequent, though she never failed to bring the family by at least once a week. Scout, now strong and healthy, began staying away longer during hunting expeditions. The final visit came on the first snow of winter. Luna approached Marcus on the porch alone, her three healthy cubs waiting at the tree line. She sat directly in front of him and placed one paw on his knee, a gesture that had become their private farewell ritual over the months. But this time was different. She stood, walked to the edge of the porch, and released a long, melodious call that echoed through the valley. Each of her cubs answered in turn, their voices carrying clearly across the snow-covered clearing. Then Luna did something that brought tears to Marcus's eyes. She returned to him and pressed her forehead gently against his hand, a gesture of affection he'd only seen between bonded lynx pairs. As she walked away to rejoin her family, Scout broke from the group and ran back to Marcus. The young lynx, now nearly full-grown, repeated his mother's gesture, then released his own call, a sound Marcus recognized as goodbye. They disappeared into the forest, leaving Marcus alone with the gathering snow and the knowledge that he had witnessed something truly unbelievable. A wild mother's desperate love creating a bridge between species that science insisted could never exist. Even now, years later, Marcus occasionally finds gifts on his porch, perfectly arranged bones, unusual stones, even once a particularly beautiful feather. Luna's way, perhaps, of reminding him that some bonds transcend the boundaries between wild and human, creating connections that defy belief and touch the very essence of what it means to trust.